most of what you see and hear around you, not only when you turn on your TV set or your radio, but when you simply walk down the street, most of this is based upon theories that are designed to drive you stark raving mad. Today, American culture is dominated by a group of theories which can be usefully lumped together under the term post-modernism. These include all manner of so-called political correctness, multiculturalism, Afrocentrism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, different, often hostile ideologies. But they all share a core philosophy. Stripped of the jargon, postmodernism is really very old stuff and can be traced to the racist ideology of Aristotle. But the proximate origins of the philosophy that we're dealing with today can be traced to three sources: the proto-Nazi 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the card-carrying Nazi 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, and the nominally communist philosophers of the so-called Frankfurt School. And no postmodernist of today would disagree, no matter what stripe they are, with this characterization of their ideology. The purpose of all postmodernist theory is to create what Georg Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, called the culture of pessimism. That culture, art, music, literature, and the banal, popularized versions of that we call entertainment, could be turned into a weapon of social control if, and only if, the optimism which is inherent in Western Judeo-Christian civilization could be subverted. Back in 1922, Lukács was commissioned by the Communist International to figure out why Bolshevism had not succeeded beyond the borders of Russia. He and the group of Marxist theorists, which he gathered together in Frankfurt, Germany, determined that the problem was, to make a very long story short, that the West still had the concept of a soul. That is, despite the pessimism that was widespread amongst cultural elites, especially after the collapse of the United States as a moral superpower after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Despite this pessimism, there was a countervailing tendency, an optimistic tendency within Western civilization. The West still taught that the individual had a soul, a divine spark of reason, that through the exercise of reason, the individual could discern with ever greater clarity God's plan of creation, which meant that no matter how bad things got, there was always the hope that mankind could solve its problems. Now, the Frankfurt School determined that this optimism could not stand if there were to be revolution in the West. As Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, wrote at the time, people must become convinced that they live in a world that has been abandoned by God, and that their only hope is revolution. And now in this, Lukács was echoing very consciously the sentiments of his acknowledged forebear, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had written, and I quote, "We must give the coup de grace to that other and even more fatal atomism that Christianity has been teaching, the atomism of the soul. Let us be permitted to use that term to denote the belief that regards the soul as something ineradicable, eternal, indivisible, as a monad. That belief must be thrown out of science," unquote. Now, Nietzsche's specification of Leibniz's concept of the monad is crucial here. For all postmodernist theory, from Nietzsche on, depends absolutely on the denial of the individual sovereign power of creative reason as discussed by Leibniz. Now, the Frankfurt School and its collaborators determined that the easiest angle of attack was on the highest expressions of Judeo-Christian culture itself. New theories had to be created to radically redefine art in such a way as to prove that science in art was not possible. That the basic technologies that had been developed so that art might embody the soaring aspirations of mankind were merely outdated bourgeois niceties. For instance, the very basic stuff, that the concept of the narrative, that art has a story to tell, was obsolete. That figuration and perspective, the breakthrough by which an artist can bring us into the space of a painting, was obsolete. That tonality and the lawful development in music or poetry was obsolete. These theories were developed, and they are the operant theories of art today. These theories are the single reason why most of you in this audience can look at an example of modern art, modern music, modern poetry, and say, that's silly, that's stupid. But all of the critics and most of the professors can respond, you poor, unsophisticated person. Don't you realize this is great art? And it's worth a lot more money than you'll ever see. Let me give you a little taste of how this operates. If we could have the lights down a bit and the slides. Are we ready? Okay. Vincent van Gogh. Obvious title, Three Pairs of Shoes. 1887. Now, a lot of people like Van Gogh. I'm sorry I could only had time to get a black and white slide. Doesn't hurt the argument. I show this slide because Martin Heidegger, the Nazi founder of existentialism, wrote a very influential essay on this particular picture. Heidegger says that what makes this painting a breakthrough is that it is not just a still life, still lives not having people in them, but the choice of shoes without people as opposed to fruit or flowers. As the subject of the painting is actually a polemic, because it forces the viewer to recognize that the shoes have been detached from the people who wear them. So that the painting is a conscious statement of dehumanization. And because the painting is forcibly dehumanized, says Martin Heidegger, you have a better concept of the painting as an object of art, and the viewer, you, can understand more clearly your position as a member of dehumanized society. And Heidegger adds that this polemic is aided by the conscious degeneration of perspective here. Okay. It works. 20 years later, the narrative, which is still more or less there in the Van Gogh, is now almost gone. Perspective has more or less disappeared. The painting does not exist in your space. In fact, it doesn't even exist in your time. The figure in the bottom right corner is painted consciously in two different time frames. We have, with Picasso and his collaborators, the conscious primitivization of art, a reversal, a conscious reversal of centuries of development. 20 years later, you don't need to bother with the obsolete concepts of narrative, figuration, or perspective. Grade school geometry and color juxtaposition will suffice. 20 years later, you don't need more than one color. 20 years later, and the polemic takes its mature form. I see all the Ballantine fans out there. What's happening here? There is no art. There is no art. There are just things. There are just feeling states and individual values. Art is whatever I say is art. Now, the same thing is true in architecture. Here is the recently completed international headquarters of ATT in Manhattan by Philip Johnson, who is the most influential architect in America today and a leading postmodern. Those of you who are familiar with antique furniture will notice that the building is topped with what looks suspiciously like a Chippendale furniture ornament. And that is what it is. The architect claims that by putting a 50-story antique set of drawers in the middle of New York, he has forced the viewer to rethink his or her concepts of the purpose of architecture. Now, just compare in your minds for a second. I don't have the slides. Compare in your minds the moral purpose of the architects of the Parthenon or the Chartres Cathedral with the moral purpose of the architect of this nonsense. Now, there's also an extremist wing of postmodern architecture, which is called literally deconstructionist architecture. And you'll hear more about deconstructionism specifically later on in this conference. This is real. This is the Best Product showroom in Towson, Maryland. It's about an hour from here. You can see that a terrible natural disaster has torn the facade off. Unfortunately, in this case, the natural disaster was the deconstructionist architect. And here's my personal favorite. This is a multi-million-dollar new research center at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. False facades, exposed pipes that lead nowhere, and a window hung by a chimpanzee. No offense to chimpanzees. Now, what I have shown you is ugly. It was meant to be ugly. All of this is supposed to be great art, according to the Frankfurt School and the other postmodernists, because it forces you to accept the truth that life is ugly under capitalism, and that you have no soul, and that your life leads nowhere, except whatever bodily titillation that you might obtain along the way. Now, I could, if we had the time, do a comparable demonstration for today's literature, poetry, dance, music. All of it ugly. All of it based explicitly on these theories. All of it designed to reverse consciously thousands of years of human mental development. And that's why postmodernism has been so heavily sponsored over the last 25 to 30 years. Postmodernist artistic theory is the cultural expression of post-industrial economic theory. It says that the only form of progress possible is the advance of the individual's hedonism. Now, unfortunately, the work of the Frankfurt School was not limited to the theoretical, as you can partially say. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the Frankfurt School was relocated to the United States through the good offices of the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Jewish Committee, and Columbia University. One of the most important operations of the school in America was something called the Radio Project, set up with funds from CBS Network and the federal government at Princeton University in 1936. The dominant force in the Radio Project was the Frankfurt School's Theodoro Adorno, who had realized that there had to be new forms of culture created to complete the dehumanization and alienation of society. Especially important, said Adorno, was leisure activity, for that was the period when people sat down to think. They threatened to think, potentially dangerous to the Frankfurt School's plans. Adorno identified that the introduction of the motion picture, radio, and television, and Adorno was one of the very first people to talk about the theoretical implications of television back in the 1940s, that these things had begun to change the way people approached art. Adorno realized that the electronic mass media were a kind of universal solvent. They reduced everything to entertainment. For instance, you put a masterpiece of classical music on the radio, and most people actually don't hear the piece as an intellectual whole. They split it up into the easy or familiar parts that entertain them, and into the difficult parts, which they forget instantaneously. People, said Adorno, become more primitive in their listening and approach art just like sports. And he said, and I quote, "They are not childlike, the listeners, you and me, but they are childish. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded," unquote. Now, the radio project actually developed instrumentalities based upon this analysis. The most important of these is something called the Stanton-Lazarsfeld Program Analyzer, officially. It's known in the business as Little Annie, a device for testing programming. The test audience is hooked up to a rheostat which can register the degrees of like and dislike by, over the course of a show. So the purpose is not to determine what people thought of the show as a whole, because that requires higher mental functioning in which the radio project was uninterested, but to gauge the moment-to-moment feeling states of the audience. Then the dissociated moments could be reproduced, and this device is now used, has been, and is today universally used to test all new television, all new film, all new radio and commercial programming. That's why there's nothing new on television. Certain plot situations, certain pairing of actors, certain musical accompaniment that rate highly on these devices are transposed, combined, recombined, recombined endlessly, and people watch it because they're looking actually at something very familiar, like an old sweater. And in the 1980s, Little Annie, this device, was universally started to be used in political campaigns. And the man who owns the largest program analyzer in this country used in politics is Robert Teeter, who was George Bush's 1992 campaign manager. You see, TV is the triumph of postmodernist theory, as Adorno predicted it would be. Everything becomes superficial. That's from Don Hewitt, who was the founder of 60 Minutes. Everything becomes desensitized, dehumanized. Television news is not information, it is entertainment. The network anchors are not journalists, they're entertainers. ABC's Peter Jennings was created by careful profiles by Rune Ardledge, the head of ABC Sports. People who think they are informed love to watch the political talk shows. They don't understand it's carefully crafted entertainment. It's called value conflict in the business. You have a stock conservative character, you have a stock liberal character, you have a mediator who's neutral, they throw zingers at each other, you root for your team, and it's all designed that way as entertainment. Over the last few years, TV has begun to fulfill the role set for it by Adorno, especially with the introduction of the immensely popular rock videos, which shrink the attention span down to 2 minutes of irrationalism and pornography. This is a statement by the man who created Mort Downey that went on to found MTV, and he is now a media advisor to Albert Gore. We are now fulfilling the horrible circle that has been set up for us by the Frankfurt School. Now, incidentally, the radio project also was responsible for the development of modern public opinion polling, which since 1972 has been in partnership with TV, the dominant force in American elections. And the pollsters go to great lengths, like this statement of George Gallup in the 1940s, to say how scientific and important they are. Of course, George Gallup's assistant had a slightly different point of view. Polls are a wonderful example of cognitive dissonance. Everybody says they don't trust them and everybody believes them. They're garbage, even if the results say what you want them to say. The whole concept is absurd if you think about it, because it depends on your denial of your own soul, your own sovereign soul. A monad is a majority by definition. In questions of morality and science, the truth carries the majority, even if only one person knows the truth. In addition, technically polls don't exist, and if people want to find out how that works in the question period, we can. Where does this all lead? Could we quickly get to the videotape? Because they're about to put the hook on me. Forget it. I'll just describe it. What it is merely an... Are you all being entertained? This is not me. It's not this self-reflexive. This is very postmodernist to be just constantly self-reflexive like this. Yeah, exactly. Now people know I'm real because they've seen me on television. There it is.
Continuing our discussion now with Lyndon LaRouche. Mr. LaRouche, we're almost out of time, but as you know, as a credible presidential candidate, you're going to have to learn to talk in television sound bites. So give me your vision.
That's it. That's all I wanted to show. Postmodernism's ultimate goal, is to make you incapable of participation in the political process. Can I have that one last slide? To make you believe, as the Frankfurt School's Walter Benjamin said, and you'll get that slide in just a second, and he said this 50 years ago, that politics have no moral end. It's just another form of entertainment where you root for your team against the other team and vote the way the polls tell you to vote. Ted Koppel's comment to Lynn says it all. Most people have been trained to be hostile to complicated answers and to accept the kind of calculated superficialities that ratify their own prejudices. The American people have been, in Adorno's phrase, forcibly retarded. Now, I want all of you in the audience to think of yourselves as educators. Education, in the very first instance, aims at increasing the child's attention span so that the real work of education can begin. That is what we must do. This nation will not survive without a population that is capable of understanding complicated answers, like those given by Lyndon LaRouche and written weekly in New Federalist. We must help our fellow citizens look past the ugliness that is making them stupid and let them see the beauty which is mankind's birthright. Thank you.
The next presentation is by Jeffrey Steinberg. Jeff is the counterintelligence editor of the Executive Intelligence Review. He is co-editor of at least 2 books, which he admits to having co-authored. One is Dope Incorporated. The other is The Ugly Truth About the ADL. And he will speak today on the subject of money laundering and sports. Jeff?
To repeat a central point that Mike Minnicino just presented, through the medium of popular culture, especially the Hollywood entertainment industry, a communist international scheme, so to speak, hatched just a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution by people like Lukács, Adorno, Max Horkheimer, is on the verge of destroying the United States and much of Western civilization, of destroying our essential goodness, embodied in the Western Judeo-Christian notion of the sanctity of the individual soul. Ironically, this is taking place at the exact same time that the Berlin Wall has been torn down and the Soviet Union has collapsed. Communism may be dead and discredited for many people on the streets of Moscow, but in Hollywood, communism, in its Frankfurt School form, is not only alive and well, it's booming. It has become, in the closing decades of the 20th century, America's last remaining growth industry. The mass marketing of cultural pessimism and forced retardation has replaced scientific progress, technologically intensive manufacturing, and modern agriculture as the heart and soul of the American economy. Cultural subversion today is a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise, and the executors of the Frankfurt School's cultural warfare are among America's wealthiest entrepreneurs. Just consider the following. Last year, the worldwide sale and distribution of radio, television, and film products generated $150 billion in revenue. About $40 billion of that reflected domestic sales here in the United States alone. Add on to that U.S. figure nearly $50 billion in sales of audio and visual equipment, $10 billion in sporting goods sales, $30 billion in toy sales, probably an increasing amount of that being adult toys of all sorts of unimaginable forms, $500 billion in legal casino gambling, and $50 billion spent on alcohol. That totals $680 billion spent on ostensibly legal, mind-deadening entertainment in the United States in 1992. And one can immediately add on another $40 billion passed directly into the hands of the ADL's friends in organized crime through illegal gambling in the United States last year. And of course, we have not yet even mentioned the $800 billion in sales last year of illegal drugs. About half of those sales occurred right here in the United States. 32 years ago, speaking at a conference sponsored by the United States State Department's U.S. Information Agency at the California Medical School in San Francisco, Aldous Huxley spelled out his future vision for America. And when I read this quote from Huxley, people should think back to the Pike-Mazzini dialogues and correspondence that Tony Chaikin talked about earlier. Huxley said at the U.S. government conference, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution." What we have today with our multi-trillion-dollar a year combined legal and underground entertainment industry in this country borders so close on Huxley's final revolution that it will take an extraordinary effort to turn back this New Age onslaught. We are at the center of that effort, and I, for one, am optimistic that we can succeed. The task, nevertheless, is formidable. Here in America, in Western Europe, and increasingly in Eastern Europe and the territories of the former Soviet Union, this mass marketing of literally Sodom and Gomorrah is spreading like wildfire. The radio, TV, and film industry last year reported a growth rate of 15%. What auto, steel, or petrochemical firm could report such figures for fiscal year 1992? The gross profits from the sale of illegal drugs are doubling every 5 years. These dollar figures that I've been tossing around may seem a bit abstract, so let's do some comparison shopping and see what these sums of money are capable of purchasing. Let's just look at the defense budget, which is something that many politicians are very fond of hammering away at. Way back in 1978, when Lyndon LaRouche first commissioned the writing of the book Dope Incorporated, we determined that the gross sales of illegal drugs for that year alone were somewhere in the vicinity of between $250 and $300 billion, a relative pittance by today's standards. By comparison, however, the entire cost of the U.S. war in Vietnam was less than $230 billion. Americans spent more money buying illegal narcotics in 1 year, every year during the 1980s, than the entire cost of the Vietnam War. The cumulative gross profits of the illegal drug sales from 1978, when we first wrote Dope Incorporated, up until 1990, conservatively add up to $6.25 trillion. That is more than the entire cost to the U.S. government and the U.S. people of the Cold War from 1945 until the fall of the Berlin Wall. This includes the Korean War, the missile race, Vietnam, all of the CIA and Pentagon covert wars, the entire defense and intelligence budget of the post-World War II epoch. But in a certain sense, even these figures are a bit deceptive. They grossly understate the devastating impact of drugs and money laundering on the economy. In the wave of cultural pessimism that swept across America following the assassinations of the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the policymaking establishment in the United States adopted the insane dogma of what was called the post-industrial society. That's quite a politically correct term. It's like calling death post-life. The effect on the American economy of the adoption of the post-industrial society program was more or less the equivalent of death. In a sequence of stunning reforms beginning under Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. financial system was put through the free market post-industrial ringer. Richard Nixon, who, by the way, passed the most generous investment tax credits on to the entertainment industry, in his infamous August 15, 1971 New Economic Policy, decoupled the dollar from the gold-based system of fixed exchange rates. Nixon, in effect, inaugurated what is today a $1 trillion a day unregulated currency speculation market. Through Kissinger's oil hoax of 1973 to 74, energy costs were artificially inflated. The oil multinationals and their allied banks made a killing in what came to be known as petrodollars and eurodollars, and our farming and manufacturing base took its first really big hit. Next came the deregulation frenzy, beginning in 1978 under the Carter Trilateral Commission administration. Banking deregulation is a Washington Wall Street euphemism for the legalization of drug money laundering, plain and simple. Between 1978 and 1982, all existing regulations that protected banks against invasion by offshore illegal capital were abolished. Dope trafficking may have remained technically illegal in this country, but the flow of dope dollars into the main arteries of the American banking system were totally legalized. Prior to this banking deregulation, money laundering was a fairly labor-intensive business. Organized crime had taken a big chunk of its Prohibition-era profits and built up the Nevada gambling industry, the motion picture industry, professional sports, and other high-volume cash businesses to facilitate laundering their dirty money. With the dope offensive of the 1970s, however, this mode of money washing no longer sufficed. Since organized crime, the Lansky Syndicate, the ADL, were always just assets of the international financial oligarchy and their southern jurisdiction, Scottish Rite infrastructure, it was no problem to call on other assets, in the Congress in particular, to turn the world banking system into one big laundromat for dirty cash. The FBI and the Federal Reserve, which along with the ADL were treasonous turn-of-the-century creations of the Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson crowd, provided critical aid in this narco-dollar offensive. The FBI, through its 1979 abscam frame-up of Senator Harrison Williams, broke the congressional opposition to bank deregulation. Senator Williams was pushing legislation to reestablish international banking ground rules to protect American banks and you, the depositors. Courtesy of gay Edgar Hoover's FBI, Senator Williams was carted off to federal prison, and the U.S. Congress rolled over and played dead. For the most part, they're still playing dead today. The abscam message from the FBI to the Congress was very simple. Take your money and your marching orders from the ADL, from organized crime, and from the southern jurisdiction, and we'll leave you alone. Take on the banks, and you're as good as dead. The Fed, particularly after Paul Volcker's appointment as chairman in 1979, delivered the second devastating blow to the U.S. banking system by progressively jacking up interest rates to over 20%. What honest businessman could borrow money at 20% to invest in manufacturing expansion, job creation, plant modernization? What farmer, even a farmer who owned his own land outright, could buy seed and fertilizer, replace equipment, or irrigate his or her land at 20% interest rates? What average Joe could take out a home mortgage at those exorbitant, usurious rates? On the other hand, the combined effect of eliminating of the bank transparency laws and the Fed's high interest rate policy turned our banks and saving institutions into safe and lucrative havens for offshore drug money. It's no wonder that when President Reagan briefly toyed with the idea back in the spring of 1981 of dumping Volcker as chairman of the Fed, in large measure at the urging of Lyndon LaRouche and the growing political movement at that time that stood behind the demand to eliminate the power of the Fed, David Rockefeller personally visited the White House and threatened to unleash, quote, a financial firestorm over Washington, unquote, if the president did not back down. By 1982, the U.S. banking system was more addicted to dope dollars than the worst junkie on the street was addicted to heroin or cocaine. The banking system had dried up as a source of credit for honest investors out to create productive jobs in manufacturing or farming. Narco dollars flooded into the U.S. and brought new ruin to what was left of the American economy. Junk bonds became the new preferred mode of financing for the real estate bubble and corporate asset stripping. Junk bonds as in junk that was being peddled on the streets of America to generate the cash for these things. Most of you are familiar with the dramatis personae. Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, both generous multi-million-dollar tax-exempt contributors to the ADL. The ADL's own national chairman and top Wall Street lawyer, Kenneth Bialkin, the man who put Robert Vesco and the Medellin cartel in the dope business. All are members of Meyer Lansky's National Crime Syndicate. In the case of Milken and Boesky, they briefly went to jail for their ostensible crime, insider trading. But these fellows were never prosecuted for their real crime, dope money laundering. Michael Milken, who operated out of the Beverly Hills, i.e. Hollywood, branch office of Drexel Burnham Lambert, could access tens of billions of dollars on a moment's notice. By 1984, when Milken was orchestrating Carl Icahn's planned takeover of Phillips Petroleum, he could write what he called, quote, a highly confident letter, simply asserting that he could deliver $4 billion in cash for the corporate takeover and looting. No cash on the barrel, no role whatsoever for any commercial bank, just the word of Michael Milken. Where was the money? The closest thing to an answer that Milken ever gave was offshore. Now, who in their right mind would have even a second thought about what Milken was referring to when he proclaimed his ability to access tens of billions of dollars parked somewhere offshore? The entire economy of virtually every country in the Caribbean couldn't generate $10 billion in liquidity in 20 years' time, and he was talking about accessing tens of billions of dollars offshore. On the strength of those two words, highly confident, and on the narco dollars standing behind them, Milken's raiders cut a path through corporate America that left in its wake plant closings, layoffs, a string of Chapter 11 bankruptcies, the SNL debacle, the blowout of the commercial real estate market, and now the pending unavoidable blowout of the commercial bank sector. It is impossible to comprehend what happened to the physical economy, our financial system, or our culture over the past 25 years without understanding the full meaning of this narco-dollar phenomenon. In the 1980s, this was heralded as the consumer-led recovery. Increase in consumption, however, is not in every instance a good thing. Just ask the snake who's biting his own tail what happens if he increases his consumption too rapidly. That's more or less what happened to the U.S. economy over the last 25 years, since the assassination of President Kennedy and the introduction on a mass scale of this irrationalist, culturally pessimistic garbage. Fortunately, there is someone on the scene who has had an awful lot of experience fighting against these monsters and has a field commander's sense of how to hit the enemy on his most vulnerable flank. I'm talking about Lyndon LaRouche. Recently, Mr. LaRouche issued a call for the U.S. government to impose a 0.1% tax on all derivative transactions. The derivative markets are all of the unregulated spawns of the bank deregulation and narco-dollar invasions we've been discussing here. It's speculative betting on future values of currencies, stock indexes, you name it. Your grandfather's shirt size 3 years from now. There are even derivative markets betting on future bankruptcy liquidation rates, and that's a real growth industry for you. LaRouche's proposal is very simple. Force speculators to declare all of these derivative transactions and collect this 0.1% tax on the nominal value of the items being bought or swapped. By forcing these transactions into the light of day under penalty of criminal prosecution for failure to report them, it becomes possible to trace the vast majority of the dirty money flows. By imposing this tax, revenues are generated that in no way interfere with legitimate and productive economic activity. It's a tax on the parasites playing with your future using dope dollars. How much are we talking about? On a daily basis, there are about $1 trillion in foreign currency transactions, the majority of which occur on these derivative markets. $300 billion a day in trading goes on in various kinds of bonds. The little tax that LaRouche is talking about could mean additional revenues of over $1 billion a day. You want to wipe out the official federal government deficit of $300 billion in 1 year or less without any new taxes targeted at honest citizens? without any further damage to what remains of our legitimate economy, then let's launch an all-out effort to get this derivative tax implemented, taking the kind of spirit and using the kinds of methods that Mr. LaRouche referred to yesterday in the efforts during the 1982-83 period. That one little act would start the ball rolling for the reestablishment of national banking and the revival of the American system of political economy. It will stop the hemorrhaging. It won't turn back the onslaught of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it will be an indispensable first step towards restoring our nation and the world as a whole to sanity. Even more importantly, it will be a victory for cultural optimism, one in what we must establish as a long string of such necessary victories. Tearing down the Pike statue is another one. Destroying the Southern jurisdiction in the ADL, another. Victories for cultural optimism. And that, more than anything else, is really what is required to save the world today. Thank you.